Thank you so much and good morning, y'all. My name is Bailey Bursick and I'm here with my colleague, Mark Morzinski. And y'all may know us from the 425 show, which is our weekly live stream that we do across Twitch, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where we talk about various identity and security topics. If you're not already subscribed, definitely check that out. And you may also know us from being product managers at Microsoft. And so today we're going to talk about the last year and a half of our lives that we've spent deploying CIEM solutions across various customers. Now, the CIEM solution that we're experts in is Entra Permissions Management, but you'll see throughout the talk today that we'll have recommendations that apply to any type of CIEM solution that we have. In fact, our solution is not on any of the slides. So you'll be able to find value from this, whether or not you are a Microsoft shop. So without further ado, we have our agenda for today where we're going to discuss what CIEM is, because I imagine, real quick show of hands, how many of y'all have heard of CIEM before? All right, I see a couple.
Yeah.
And then for those of you, I know we have several folks that are in the Slack. I think I saw there were about 750 of y'all. So if you are watching on the live stream, feel free to put some of this as well in the Slack. Afterwards, I'll go back and read it because I want to see if we have equivalencies across who we have in the room as well as who we have online. So we're going to go through what CIEM is, some of the findings that we've seen over the past year and a half, and then I'm going to hand it over to Mark, and he's going to talk about actually getting to least privilege in practice. And we're going to give you all some go-dos so that when you come back after this conference, you'll be able to have value with your management. And I see some of y'all taking notes. Feel free to take some on what you see here today, but we also already have the slides uploaded as a PDF online, and we'll give you the short link afterwards. So don't feel the need to quick and make a screenshot online or grab a photo with your phone, because we'll have that all for you in the go-to section. Now with that, I want to start with the definition of what CIEM is. And yes, it's pronounced CIEM like the name. And this originated from Gartner recently. So it's a new term. If you haven't heard of it, that's okay. And so essentially what we've seen over the years is that there has been an increase in the amount of permissions that customers have been needing to monitor. And I'm going to go through 3 qualities that Gartner has defined CIEM solutions as having, and they're going to emerge throughout the presentation. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to see and understand what a CIEM solution is and how it fits into your environment. So Gartner mentions that when we talk about a cloud infrastructure entitlement management or CIEM offering, oftentimes we're looking at something that is for hybrid and multi-cloud environments. Now, I imagine a lot of y'all are multi-cloud or hybrid. Quick show of hands. I'm anticipating quite a few to go up. Or if you work with customers who are hybrid or multi-cloud, I think that's the reality for most of us today, especially for folks online as well. Let me know if you see something different. But the vast majority of customers that I talk with are hybrid or multi-cloud. And with that as well, when we talk about CIEM solutions, oftentimes you'll see that they have different machine learning or detection capabilities to determine anything that might be weird or abnormal, to show you those anomalies in your environment with regard to permissions and dormant and unnecessary entitlements. And CIEM solutions are also able to provide remediation and enforcement of least privilege. So we're able to see that something is weird and an anomaly, and then we're able to take action on it. And so this relates to what we're seeing in the real world, not just the definitions that we're seeing, across various analysts, but we're seeing an exponential growth in terms of identities, and that's both human users and workload identities. And so on the Microsoft side, we're actually able to see the telemetry across, various organizations that over 90% of both human and workload identities are using less than 5% of the permissions that they are granted. Now, if I'm an attacker, this is something that's really attractive to me, something I want to take advantage of, because also over 50% of those permissions are incredibly high risk. And if you want to think about how catastrophic that could be, a couple of years ago, I believe Mark gave a presentation with a colleague of ours on those application permissions and how if you have highly privileged apps, what folks can do in your environment. Those same permissions are across user and workload identities, which last year, virtually at this event, myself and my colleague Eitan presented on that being an emerging vector for attackers to take advantage of. So this is something that's not going to go away. In fact, it's going to continue to expand and become more important. So you're going to see this pop up again and again throughout the next couple of years. And this permissions gap that we're seeing, and I'm sure that as we can relate over time, as users stay with the company, and not just your employees, but also guest users, partner organizations stay with y'all, there is an increase over time in the permissions that they accumulate because I'm requesting access to do more things. And so over time, what we're seeing is this permission gap between the permissions that are actually granted and the permissions that are used by these users. And then as mentioned on the previous slides, where we're talking about problems that customers are seeing, there is a lack of comprehensive visibility into those identities and permissions. We're also seeing increased complexity as we're going multi-cloud because we're not only having to manage across Azure, we're looking at AWS, we're looking at GCP, any other cloud providers. And we're also seeing an increased risk of breach from either accidental, where I as a user was given that permission, I think that I'm doing something appropriate for my job, but I might be messing something up, making a change I shouldn't be able to make that change for, or an attacker taking advantage of it because it's an attractive target. As we talk with customers, we've noticed quite a few common challenges, and I'm sure y'all can relate to these and you'll start to notice them as well as you start to have these conversations. So first of all, permissions tend to be granted based off of broad job roles and responsibilities. So this is particularly if you are an admin and you think about how Alice and Bob being new users at an organization, they're both security engineers, but in their day-to-day, Alice, she may be using more permissions than Bob in order to accomplish different tasks because their managers have assigned them to do different things. Unless you are completely micromanaging all your users or you work for a super teeny tiny company, it is going to be near impossible for you to know what everybody is doing on a day-to-day basis. And this grows over time, especially if you are a multinational organization. And especially if you work with financial services organizations, I know there's a regulation at play that you have to grant or permissions based off of job title. So if you think about that, that doesn't always align with the day-to-day or the reality of what those users are doing. Second of all, we're seeing that these permissions are being granted and it's not in a time-bound manner. So for those of you who are taking classes this week, you might hear about just-in-time access or where you need to elevate up to be able to get access or to do those various permissions. Versus what we're seeing is that we have standing access where we always have these permissions and we're able to leverage these. Again, as an attacker, that's really exciting for me because if I'm able to take over that, I can do a lot of really cool stuff. And permission cleanup. So this is something that's not super fun because I don't think anyone likes, cleaning up things. And it's also not something that when you go talk with your management about all the cool things you did this week, that's oftentimes not something as sparkly or exciting. So what we're seeing across various customers is that cleanup happens all or nothing. So it's as needed. If something happens, then we go back and we clean things up. But oftentimes it's not happening on a regular basis. And when it does happen, it's really frustrating to have to go through and audit everything. It can be a huge pain. So actually getting to least privilege is a very frustrating process and can take much longer than we're anticipating. Now, I want to go back to the 3 points that I mentioned when Gartner has these definitions of what a CIEM offering does. And so when we look at that again, how can this help with those various challenges that you're seeing? First of all, identifying that risk and being able to monitor across hybrid and multi-cloud environments. I saw several hands go up about multi-cloud, and I'm sure there were several folks online who are also dealing with multi-cloud environments. And that is very difficult, especially coordinating across multiple teams. We're also seeing that being able to, again, monitor with machine learning. What are Alice and Bob actually doing day to day? They're both security engineers, but is Alice using various permissions that are tailored to what she's doing that Bob might not need? Maybe we can remove them for him. And then that actual enforcement, that taking action on what we see. Now, I want to back up and give a little bit of both a history and a vocab lesson because I know that this is something new and we have folks coming at this from various points in time. So I want to begin with the end in mind with CNAP. So again, quick poll, how many of y'all have heard of the term CNAP before? Okay, less hands. This is what I was expecting. It's new. So also I want to see another quick show of hands for those of y'all who have heard of this term. How many of your organizations or the organizations you work with actually have a strategy surrounding CNAP?
Even less hands.
Even less hands. Yeah. And then online, I imagine to see the same, but please pop it in the Slack because I'm super curious. So I'm going to define it. So don't worry, if you don't know this, it's not on the test or anything. But when we look at timelines here, if we go back a little over 10 years ago, so virtual machines were the new sparkly toy that everybody was playing with. We're starting to see the emergence of cloud technologies. And for the first time ever, our workloads are not running on our personal data centers. They're running somewhere else where we can't see them. So that's when we started to see in about 2010 CWPP, or Cloud Workload Protection Platforms, come onto the scene, where we're looking at how can we monitor those various workloads. And about that time when Azure first launched, I know Carl Otz had a great presentation yesterday where he walked through the timeline of the various services in the beginning, and then over time as we saw cloud computing explode in terms of what was offered. At that time, Azure had about 5 services. And then once containers started to come into where folks were using those, there was about a couple hundred services that were available for Azure. And the same was true across various cloud providers. Then we started to see CSPMs, or Cloud Security Posture Management Platforms, come onto the scene. And again, multiple hands went up for multi-cloud. So we're not just talking about Azure here. We're talking about folks also having AWS and GCP in their environment and various other clouds. Then we needed CMPs, or cloud management platforms, to be able to actually manage everything that's going on across multiple clouds. More things started coming onto the scene, serverless infrastructure as code, and we're seeing that explosion of permissions. That in that same timeline graph where I showed, as the time goes on, those permissions increase. We're seeing that we need CIEM offerings or solutions to be able to monitor those permissions across all of our clouds, to see what's going on and whether Alice and Bob have the right permissions assigned to them. So then finally, in 2020, Gartner and a couple other analysts were saying that we need to be looking into CNAP, or Cloud Native Application Protection Platforms. And that's really in this Venn diagram, as you see, this holistic view at how all of these pieces fit together, and to have a holistic view of what's going on across our clouds and what's going on with both our users and those permissions throughout the entire process. So now I want to get into what we've actually found. So now we all know what CIEM is, and I want to talk about the past year and a half that we've spent talking with customers of various size, from small, medium businesses, all the way up to multinational Fortune 500 companies. And things that we've noticed when we first have a conversation about CIEM is getting the right folks in the room. And you might experience this as well as you start to have conversations about this too. So of course, we know that we're going to need our identity teams involved because we're talking about users here and we're talking about what they need to be assigned. We also know that we have multi-cloud environments, and for most teams, these are split across with Azure teams, AWS teams, GCP teams. And if you have the multiple clouds in your environment, you better have all of them on the call to make sure that they're all on the same place or understand what you're going to be rolling out. You're also going to need your information security teams, because we are doing something with removing permissions and looking at how we can reduce our risk. And then we're also looking into security and audit. So again, as I mentioned, if you work in a very regulated industry, particularly financial services, I live in New York, they give me a lot of the banks to work with. So we see this pop up time and time again, that we need to be monitoring and making sure that we are following those regulations, particularly that one where it talks about job functions being assigned based on, or permissions being assigned based off of job function, which can oftentimes conflict. So make sure that audit and security assurance are there. We also need to think about our technical owners of our target resources. So that would be both our admins and our developers. Since we are looking at cutting away those permissions, we want to make sure that nothing is breaking, especially something that might be business critical. And lastly, this is someone that's often forgotten, especially with a CIEM conversation, because you might think that this is purely proactive. But you'll see in just a moment why incident response is going to be so critical here as we move forward, because we found various things that organizations were not prepared in those conversations to hear that we need to take action on immediately. So once we get everybody on the call, before we actually start getting the ball rolling, we're typically told that we don't have exposed ports at that organization. That organization often usually tells us that they don't have any sort of exposed storage. That's nothing that we need to be concerned about with today. We're also often told that they use, Azure ARM or AWS CloudFormation or Terraform, as our friends at HashiCorp were talking about yesterday. So we know that things are going to be very consistent. We don't have to worry about any sort of configuration drift. And then one thing that we can typically all agree on as security professionals is that we likely have overprivileged users. So we're aware of that, and using something like CIEM will help us see across all of our clouds which users are actually overprivileged. Now, what we actually find when we get all those folks in the room and we deploy and we see what's underneath, we see that oftentimes organizations have exposed ports. We also see that they have exposed storage. And we see that they have inconsistencies despite using something like Azure ARM, because over time there is some configuration drift, which is going to lead to some heavy inconsistencies. Now, that is the reason why we need incident response. And then lastly, one other thing that we're seeing is that not only overprivileged users, but we're also seeing overprivileged groups and apps, and some of which are so overprivileged that they essentially have global admin or root access. So again, this is something that last year, Eitan and I talked about on the machine learning side. Mark talked about the year before on the applications being overprivileged. Again and again, we're seeing this pop up, and organizations are being surprised that they not just have that for their users. So incident response is super critical, and they're often left out of these discussions, and you should absolutely make sure they're on the invite. Now, after we do the incident response and we focus on things that are immediately necessary, we get into some of the more quick wins that Mark is going to walk us through.
Thanks, Bailey. First thing we're going to want to do is we want to clean up those inactive users, groups, apps, and functional apps. Many times we'll see that somebody kind of stood up some of these things just to kind of test them out, see if it met the requirements, and then they kind of moved on to something else. So we want to clean this up. This is going to make some of the work we're going to do in a little bit easier. The other thing is Billy was mentioning those open ports. We'll find open ports in Azure Network Security Groups, AWS Security Groups, and GCP VPCs. And there's actually no IaaS resources behind them. So when that got terminated and we removed that resource, we did a good job of that, but we actually didn't clean up the network side of that. So we want to remove those in case somebody accidentally attaches that to some other resource. Another thing we'll find here are users with MFA not being enabled. I know this sounds kind of silly that we're still talking about this in the year 2023, but we find it more often than not. And at this point, when we kind of talk to customers about this, we say, you know, you really should kind of like move to a phish-resistant credential at this point, something like a FIDO2, Windows Hello for Business, or certificate-based authentication. We'll also find unused IAM access keys that nobody's actually using, so we could probably clean those up. And then we'll also find things on the other end of the spectrum, where we have these access keys that have been used for a very long time. And usually this is people just didn't know, they should be rotating it, a process got broken, something like that. So for this kind of stuff, we just kind of open those trouble tickets and get this stuff remediated right away. Now, another thing that we're going to want to do right away is looking into alerting and monitoring. The reason is that it's going to take us a while to kind of get to that least privileged state. So we want to make sure we're focusing on things that we need to take action on right now. So this is going to be things like anytime somebody creates a new type of super user account that's very privileged in the environment, we probably want to reach out to them, talk to them, kind of understand what they're trying to do and why do they think they need that many permissions in the environment, and get that driven down before they go into production with it. Another thing we'll want to do is alert on any time we see a high set of permissions being used. We want to talk to those people and understand, was this actually you doing that? And then also try to understand what has changed in their business processes that's requiring them to use that high set of permissions. And another thing we'll see customers do is look for failures on specific resources like those crown jewel types of resources, or where secrets are stored, so like in Azure Key Vault. So we'll have customers turn on an alert that says, I want to see anytime somebody tries to access these key vaults and fails, because that usually means one of two things is happening. The first thing is going to be somebody misconfigured an application. They're just pointing to the wrong key vault. Let's get that cleaned up and point to the right place. The second thing is somebody is trying to get access to your key vault and they have not been successful yet. So we want to make sure the SOC is looking for this. This is a very high fidelity signal. We want to run that to ground to understand what's going on in our environment. All right, so let's talk about now getting to least privilege and what does that look like. So this is going to be a journey. And the first thing we're going to want to do is we want to find the right stakeholders in our environment, and we want to be aware of seasonal access. Nothing will get this program shut down faster than somebody just goes out there and like cowboys this thing up, removes a bunch of permissions, and an app that has to run once a year isn't able to like put everybody in the benefits enrollment system or something like that. So we've had a couple of customers get bit by that, so pay attention to that. But the first thing is really talk to those stakeholders. As Bailey kind of mentioned earlier, there's a tremendous amount of risk in the environment. We want to talk to them, get them on board, let them understand what's happening and how we're going to go ahead and drive this down. When we start to remove these permissions, we want to start with the non-human accounts whenever possible. These have repeatable access patterns and they're least likely to change. We want to start with those super workload identities that Bailey kind of mentioned, those serverless functions, those apps, that type of nature, or things that are accessing our crown jewel types of resources. If you have a super workload identity that's accessing crown jewel resources, that's an excellent place to get started. And then when we move on to the human accounts, we want to move them from these high privilege permissions to a just-in-time, just enough administration model. Even though you know that they are not using those permissions, if you come to them and tell them we're taking away your permissions, this can be a very emotional conversation. It feels like you're reducing their job responsibility, things of that nature. So what we see customers do is say, well, we're not removing your permissions. We're just removing that standing admin access. If you need those permissions, you can still get them. You have to do some sort of just-in-time, just enough administration type of thing. You can get them if you need them, but we're removing that standing access, and that tends to go over much, much better. Then we can continue to monitor this, and then eventually say, 6, 9 months, a year later, we'll be like, look, you didn't use your permissions before. You haven't used the new tool for this. Do you really need this? I think we can safely remove those from the environment. The other thing you need to think about here is, how did we get here to begin with? One of the common patterns we see with customers is they'll say, oh, this is that team or that group or that org stuff. We don't know what they need or what they're trying to do. So we'll just give them the owner God tier type of access over there. And then, once they get everything spun up that they need, we'll go back over there with them. We'll remove that access. And then, we'll kind of get to a least privilege. We know they're not going to do that. They're not going to do it. I think they kind of know they're not going to really do it either. That's something they say and hope that they're going to get to. But we see this time and time again. They never really do get to this. So if this is how you are doing some of your stuff, you really got to think about this, because you're going to have to change how you implement and do some policy stuff around that. And then lastly here, showing improvements to your leadership team. This is going to be a journey. You're going to need to continue to repeat this and keep going. Don't get discouraged. This is going to take a long time, but you'll be better today than you were the day before. So we have some of our customers that are down this journey. They're better now than they were 2 months ago, and they're a lot better now than they were 18 months ago. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking do we really need to do this? We try to follow some best practices with least privilege. It seems to be okay. This seems like a lot of work. Do I really have to do this? And the answer is, unfortunately, you do. So last week in Redmond, there was something called the Microsoft Blue Hat Conference. This is attended mostly by internal Microsoft employees and some external security researchers and members of the community. I was lucky enough to attend one of the days. The Microsoft Incident Response Team, formerly known as the Microsoft DART team. This is a team that customers can call if they're having a security incident, they need some help from us. They did a presentation about this threat actor called Octotempest, formerly known as Storm 0875. We have this link to this blog post. They're going to convert that talk into a blog post. It should be up on the Threat Intel blog either this week or next week. But Bailey and I will update that link when it goes live. But one of the things they talk about in that talk is that this threat actor will consistently use the company's infrastructure and tools against them. So we asked them if we could share one of these slides, and this is kind of what you could do to kind of prevent that. And you see here, right? Leveraging just-in-time access to applications where possible, limiting that permissions, understanding what your applications are capable of, enforcing RBAC. So if you need help trying to make that case to your leadership team that this is something you should focus on, use this blog post. This is an active threat actor, and this is some of the techniques they're using against their victims. Okay. So now that we start to get to least privilege, what does that process actually look like? So the first month or so, we want to focus on framework and process. So the first thing we're going to do is define owners and inventory of that problem space. This is typically going to be owned by the InfoSec team. One of my customers, when they're getting started on this, they said we knew we have this problem. We just don't know how big of a problem is, where the problem is, and how much risk do we really have in our environment. So at the beginning here, we're just really trying to understand that scope and what the risk is in our environment. Then we want to determine a process and permissions for new resources going forward. So things are going to continue to get spun up in our environment. That's great. It's great. That's fine. We want to make sure that they're following the new processes that we want to put in place to use least privilege. This is typically going to be owned by InfoSec and the cloud infrastructure team. But basically, we want to say from this point forward, everything new is following the right model. Now we just have to fix everything that we had done before. Basically, we don't want to make this problem any worse. And then the next thing is we need to determine what that permission creep strategy reduction is going to be. This is typically owned by InfoSec, focusing on goals and where we can do the most risk reduction in our environment. Many times we'll see this start with those crown jewel types of resources or those super user accounts. But many times as part of that inventory, we'll find that some group spun up a Azure subscription, AWS account, or a GCP project, and nobody knew about it. And it's just running critical stuff for their business, and no one's paying attention to it. So we start with that. We want to pull that into the fold, run our normal playbooks and things like that against it. So it's kind of up to you to determine where you feel like the most risk is in your environment, what those goals are for this project to drive it down. Then the next thing we kind of focus on is monitoring and tracking. We want to make sure we have really good reporting for our key stakeholders. This will be typically owned by the InfoSec team or whoever's kind of driving this project. We want to be able to report where we are as an organization today. What does that risk look like? What are the next things we're going to go remediate? And where will this risk that will be reduced after we complete that? What does that look like from a business perspective? And then kind of what's coming next. So we're going to keep doing this over and over again. Then we want to make sure we're monitoring for any changes in past permission behavior. At this point, this is going to be owned typically again by the InfoSec team and the cloud infrastructure team. We're going to have our new permissions model, the least privileges we're going to want to apply to a resource. We want to make sure nothing has changed. Like we have our historical view, we want to make sure nothing has changed. So if we do everything properly and we meet the requirements, we should not have any breaking changes here in our environment. And then lastly, additional monitoring is available for our SOC. We want this to be owned by our SOC folks. Microsoft Entra Permissions Management has lots of auditing and reports you can turn on, things like the first time somebody's used permissions, somebody's used permissions outside their normal working hours, a bunch of stuff like that. So this is a good time to sit down with your SOC, show them the different alerts and reports you have available in your CIEM system, and see if they need to integrate that into their current SOC processes and workflows. All right, and then after that, we kind of get into this remediation and run state, the operationalizing of this. So we're just going to start to remediate and get to those right-sized permissions. This is typically going to be owned by InfoSec or cloud engineering. We want to drive down those permission creep levels to the target levels we're okay with as an organization. So one of my customers, they had about a bunch of function apps that were going to go live in about 6 to 7 weeks. They were way over permissioned. So we drove those down to levels that they felt comfortable would give those functional apps enough permissions what they needed to do, plus a few other things they were planning to do, tested it out, everything looked good. They went with that before they went live in production. Then we need to think about those human identities. We want to make sure we're implementing some sort of permissions on demand. This is going to be owned by the InfoSec team in cloud engineering. We want to make sure we have processes to onboard those users, think about how we're going to do those requests, those approval workflows. Do we want to auto approve users if they're asking for a very small set of permissions on non-risky types of things? Do we need to make more custom roles or templates and things of that? So this is kind of how our users are going to get to that just in time, just enough administration. And then lastly here, we want to get to that run state, that operationalizing here. This is going to be InfoSec and cloud engineering again. Basically, we want to make sure we keep doing that regular cadence to review our activity. Is there any things we need to change? Is there something we met? Is there any process changes we need to make as we're continuing to drive this down? We have a lot of customers in this phase, and you basically at this point continue to drive the permissions down to where it's an acceptable risk level to the business. Okay, so with the last few minutes here, we're going to kind of focus on a little quick recap here and some go-dos. So the first thing is, you heard Bailey mention, you probably have gaps in your CSPM coverage. Find these and remediate this. I can tell you on some of the customers we found in their exposed storage, we have found databases, we have found intellectual property, we have found Terraform TF state files. One customer, we found a bunch of VMs running in their infrastructure that were running Second Life servers, which we didn't even know was still a thing. So like, there's probably a lot of gaps out there. Go take a look at this, find it in your environment, and start to remediate it. Then, do you have a CNAP strategy? If you don't, that's okay. This is kind of a new and emerging thing. Take a look at this cloud permission risk report that we have. This is where some of the data that Bailey talked about has come from. And take that back and start to talk to your key stakeholders in your environment, start to socialize this problem space. I don't think you're going to surprise anyone to, we tell them, I think we have users that are over permissioned, but they might not realize it also goes to groups, apps, and those serverless functions as well. Talk about that new threat actor and what they're doing and say, like, we're kind of exposed here. We have this risk. Is this something as a business that we want to focus on to drive that risk down? When we start to drive that risk down, we're going to want to, do a trial or a POC to kind of understand that scope and that risk. Many times we'll see customers start with, a test instance or maybe some of the crown jewel types of resources. And then once we find some stuff, they go, oh, we really need to expand this out to much more of our environment to kind of get our arms around this. If you're interested in doing like a POC or a trial and you're in the room, feel free to talk to Bailey and I afterwards. If you're online, message us on Slack or on LinkedIn, and we'll happy to kind of talk to you. What does that look like in your environment? When you actually then start to fix some of this stuff, start with those non-human identities. Remember, these should have a repeatable access pattern that should be pretty much easier to change and really reduce that scope. We don't have to worry about them kind of doing things out of their normal patterns. And then think about those new policies and processes. You might have to do a mindset change here. If you're still doing this is their stuff, so we just gave them that owner role and let them do what they're going to do. You got to stop that. Not only are you creating more work for yourself that you're going to have to clean up later, you are kind of putting your business more at risk with this. So with that, we should have a few minutes here left for questions. As we mentioned, the deck is available. So if you go to ak.ms/SANSDeck2023, Bailey and I uploaded it to GitHub yesterday, so you can take a look at this there, and we're happy to take any questions from the Slack as well as in the room.